18th, 1989. This is Sandra Lesh, and I'm doing oral history for Howard County. Today I will be talking with David Clarke, that's C-L-A-R-K-E. He lives at 9820 Cypress Mead Drive, Ellicott City, Maryland. Mr. Clarke, what we really would like to know is a little bit about your family history. Could you go back and tell us about maybe your parents and your grandparents, and if they originally come from Howard County?
Well, you probably have this story anyway, because the Clarks, the three brothers, came over here from Ireland in 1790, and two of them settled in Howard County. That's David and John. James went west. They say that the Indians got him and scalped him out there somewhere, but I don't believe it, because there's too many Clarks in the West. I think there's a lot of Clarks out there. No. Anyway, the Clarks that settled in Howard County, the John Clarke had a son named James who built Wheatfield, and James had a son named John who built or lived at Fairfield. And John is my grandfather. And John had a daughter named Janie, and Janie is my mother, C-L-A-R-K. Now Janie married John Clarke, C-L-A-R-K-E, and I'm the offspring of John and Janie, C-L-A-R-K and C-L-A-R-K-E. Actually, John is the son of John R. Clarke with an E, and I'll tell you a little story about the Clarks. The two John Clarks used to own the Clarksville Turnpike, and one of them was very efficient and one wasn't so efficient. One was kind of sloppy. So the one that was efficient used to put a little scribble at the end of his name, John Clarke, just two John Clark, and that scribble became the E. So the John Clarke that is my grandfather, that branch, is the efficient branch of the family. And then there was a sloppy branch out there somewhere.
I can believe that, knowing you.
But no, and there were 7 of us in my family, the siblings, Green, Susan, Janie, John, David, Bill, and Betty. And I was a baby for 4 years, so I was a baby long enough to be spoiled, but not ruined, because 2 more came along and they took my place, you see. So that's why I turned out the way, well, however that is. Anyway, I was born on a farm where the house was torn down so that they could build the Hilton Hotel there. And it used to be on the corner of Guilford Road and Columbia Road, which is now, I guess, 175 and what they call Route 29, whatever they call that now. But Route 29 used to turn up at the intersection of 108 and 29. There used to be a Ma and Pa store there, Bloom's store. And that used to be what we called Columbia. They had at one time had a post office there, and it was the Columbia Post Office.
Inside the store?
Inside the store.
Inside the Blooms.
Now, the 29 came up to that intersection and turned and went to Clarksville and to Holland and on to Sandy Spring and Holly. But when they and the road that we lived on was a gravel road, really, up until the war, probably. It was a cabin down as far as the golf course. And incidentally, the golf course was built in 1931, and I think my brother and I were the first people that caddied there. That's something of distinction, I'm not sure. But it was right in the middle of the Depression, and we were very glad to get that 75 cents, which we got for carrying the bag around the golf course, you know. But in fact, I have a picture upstairs about Wheatfield. That was James Clarke, who was my great-grandfather. I think there was an old house there, and I think he built on. But the present Wheatfield is still there. It was recently owned by Don Dow, but I don't really know who, since they've started that development around it.
How would you get to the house nowadays?
Wheatfield's on Montgomery Road. What do they call that development down there?
It's called Wheatfield.
Wheatfield, where the development is now. But they filled in the pond and they have done so much grading around there. It looks like Wheatfield stands up on a hill now. You can see the lawn and everything, which took, I think, a certain distinction away from it. It needs, in my opinion, needs more ground. Anyway, Wheatfield is still there now. Fairfield, James had a son named John. He bought Fairfield, which is property. It's just this side of the development of Beaverbrook on Route 108 now. And it's between Beaverbrook and Ten Oaks Road that goes into Columbia. They tore the house down. I don't know why they tore the house down, but it was one of these old middle 1800s gingerbread type of house. It was clapboard, and they had a porch all the way around it.
How long has the house been gone?
I think one of the first things Rouse did when they acquired the ground is stuck it in one time and bulldozed it down before anybody knew about it. Because Buddy Bales, who was raised there, who is a first cousin of mine, went up there to get a few things from the house that he wanted. And they said, well, you can come back, sure you can get them. And went back, it was gone. The house was just like that. He got practically nothing, as I understand, from it. And they just raised that, just how they do it. I don't know whether they blasted and pushed it down or how they do it, but anyway, that's the way it was. And of course, when we were growing up, the first year I went to school was in, we call it Oakland High School. It was a one-room school, grammar school, on the corner of Oakland Mills Road and Columbia Road. Right there, it's on the this side of the blacksmith shop. The house that's down in that this side. And the teacher that taught there lived in, it was Mrs. Whips, who lived in the house there, and she taught in Oakland Mills School. It was a one-room school. We had a big pot-bellied stove that heated the place. And the first year that I went to school, I sat with a girl in the second grade, so I was doing pretty good, you see. And they used to teach us to read. They used to put these cards up and it said cat and rat and this sort of thing. Well, they started out was the first grade, and then the second grade would join in the third grade. By the time they got to the end of the cards, all 7 grades were hollering out what the cards were, the writing on the cards were.
So you're the first class for sight reading then? So forget the phonics in Howard County.
But anyway, after the next year, they bought a bus up there and picked us up and took us down to Ellicott City. And I went to the grammar school and high school all in the same building.
And where was that?
That was Ellicott City High School, which is up on, St. Paul Street. Up there, it's a burnt-out, old gray brick building, beautiful building that you just let go to pot. But it was a beautiful building. And I went from the second grade there through, we graduated from high school there. And I didn't see anything wrong with education in those days, but I guess it's improved now because they have open rooms and closed rooms and more schools and all this sort of thing.
How many people were in your graduating class?
24.
24. Could you name them all?
Yes, I can name them. Yes. In fact, we had a reunion several years ago, and I think it was 15 or 16 there. I forgot which now. And of course, a few of them have passed away, and some of them just couldn't make it. But it was a nice reunion, and it was very, very nice. And Mr. Yingling was the first year that he was principal at Ellicott City. He was the last year, and I was there in high school. He was at our reunion, and it was good to see him. Of course, he's had a stroke. He's not quite as quick as he was, but he's still pretty sharp today.
Mr. Clarke, one time you told me about the house behind what the Historical Society used to belong to your aunt. Could you tell me something about that house?
Don't know much about it, really.
You would never visit there, or?
That once or twice, as I remember. Yes, it belonged to Aunt Mary Pugh. Yeah, she was, you got that thing turned on now?
Is it something we better...
No, it doesn't make a bit of difference. I didn't know very much about her. She was, her children, she was my father's sister, and father was the youngest in the family and had these older sisters. And her children were much older than I. And but I do know that on one occasion she gave us a piano, and I went down there with a neighbor of ours on a Model T truck. And Wes Thompson was a real gentleman. I can still say that of all of our neighbors, Wes Thompson was, you say that people have learned manners and that sort of thing. He was innately born with good manners and beautiful person. Anyway, we went down there in this Model T truck and backed up to the porch. As you know, there's a high porch there. And we went in. This piano must have weighed, I don't know how much it weighed. It felt like a ton. Anyway, we rolled it out and got it on that truck and came home. I stood up and held the piano in the back of this Model T truck until we got up there. We got it in the house. Of course, when we got there, we had plenty of help. Because I had, two brother older than I, my father, and a couple of men that worked on the farm there. But we put it in the house, and everybody took a turn at that piano. And I think until the house was torn down for the Hilton Hotel, I think that piano was still in what we call the drawing room there. And
What's the kind you could put the rolls in?
no,
No.
it was a real piano, ABC Chase or something, as I remember. Had a wonderful tune, and during the war, we used to get a piano player, and we'd have dances, and maybe 50, 60 kids would be invited in, and this piano player would play this thing and knew all the songs from his mind. He had no music whatsoever. And he'd play, and you were kids about 16, 17, and we just danced like crazy, you know. You just feel the whole house just going like this. So we must have been in rhythm.
Was this a neighbor or someone that you just knew that could play?
No, it was a colored man from Oakland City that we knew.
Do you remember his name?
No, can't tell you. Ambrose can probably tell you who it was. But see, I had a brother who was about a year and a half older than I, and then there's another sister a year and a half older than my brother. So we were all of an age, and we knew a lot of people around. So every week for 2 or 3 summers in there, we had a little dance at different houses. And it was a big thing for us.
About what year was that?
It was 32, 33, 34, I think, around there. And we enjoyed it thoroughly.
Could you tell us a little bit about the house and how Mrs. Pugh had it decorated? We were kind of interested since our society is now there.
Sandy, I'm going to say that when I went there and got that piano, or was down there before she sold it, as far as how the house was decorated, I have no idea whatsoever. I knew
Sounds like a boy.
I went in and looked around. I said, "Boy, it's not a very nice house." You know? And we got what we wanted, and got our cookies and this sort of thing, and came out. No, I can't remember.
Do you remember her husband's name? What her husband's name was?
No, Arthur Pugh. Arthur.
Arthur.
But I never knew Arthur Pugh because he died before I knew him.
Mm-hmm.
And Aunt Mary lived sort of a secluded life. We were in touch with her, but I guess it was a little difficult. I don't know. Not being aware of, financial conditions at that time. But it was in the early 20s, really. And then I had another aunt. Aunt Mary had a sister who was, now this is on the father's side of the family, who was Rachel McGill, lived in Atherton, a farm up there where, what do they call it? Kingston Travel. But I think that house is where the McGills lived. And
The house that the restaurant's in now.
the house with the restaurant's in, and Aunt Tacy had a son who turned out to be Jamie McGill, who was judge of Oakland City, with all these people know, you see. Jamie is a first cousin of mine, and his mother's name was Clarke, C-L-A-R-K-E. And in that particular family, there was another sister named Edith who was unmarried. She was Dr. Clarke. She worked for up in Schenectady. What is it, Westinghouse? No, General Electric, I guess it's in Schenectady. She worked up there, and she has written books on, she was an electrical engineer. Did very well, and
Did she go to school here in Maryland? Do you know?
no,
Because that's kind of odd at that time for a girl to raise to that.
I think probably, well, they were all born over to the present, at the stone house of where the Old View Golf Course is. The house is sitting there now. I'd love to have it.
Yes.
And, but somebody's messed it up because they put surroundings which aren't conducive to that type of house there. But,
If you could tell us a little bit about your house and maybe some of the neighbors and actually what your house looked like.
actually, the house was, I guess Father bought it in 1910 from Asbury Haynes, who was an old bachelor. I think he was a bachelor, not from choice, but the lady that he was going to marry at the last minute said no. So anyway, the house was, it was a nice house. It was made like, generally like most houses, I guess. We had a front porch to start with all the way across the front of the house. And it had two wisteria, one on either side, and I can remember the springs that the wisteria would hang down. It was beautiful. The wisteria has a very bad habit of tearing porches off. So somewhere along the line, that porch was taken off, and there was a small porch put on at the front door. And like most houses, you went into the hall. There were steps that went up, and on the right, on the left, was what we called the living room, and on the right was the dining room. You went aft from the dining room. There was a big, I guess today you would call it a den. It was probably 20 by 20 room, and there was an enclosed porch which had been included in the room, so it was a very large room. And that's where we had our dining room table for everyday use. And behind across the house, which I guess was another 20 by 20 room, and out of the back door there was a porch that went around to a pump house. And what was the pump house? We had a little gasoline motor there that pumped water up to the tank, which was in the attic, and it filled this water up, and then by gravity it fed down into the heating element, which was in the kitchen, there was a home comfort fire there, which we cooked by, that heated the water that was in this tank. Now, if you went out of the den, between the den and the living room, there was a big pantry where we had, each year we put up a lot of preserves and vegetables and this sort of thing. And of course, when we got hungry in the winter, we went in there. When we got hungry in the summertime, we went out to the garden, you know. But
How much land did you have at the house?
200 acres there.
So it was a working farm
Yeah,
then?
it was quite a farm. It kept us all busy, and particularly, it was very nice that we had a farm because in 29, of course, everything was gloomy, but 30 when the Depression hit, and if the Depression hits families like it hit us, it was good that we had a farm to always get potatoes and vegetables and that sort of thing, you know, chickens and eggs, and you name it. But it was very, very good. Now, I'll tell you a little story about the neighbors that we had on the Ellicott City side. I guess that was northeast. There was Charlie James and his family. That was another farm there. And back in those days, they had telephones were hooked up where if you rang it, your number may be 21, you get two longs and a short. That's 21. And your neighbor would pick up the phone and listen. And you could hear everybody up and down the road knew what was going on. So Mother was going away to visit one time, and my sister worked in Ellicott City, so she called my sister and said on Thursday, Father is going to have bread or rolls, which we always had hot rolls for dinner each night. And you call at noon and ask him how he's making out, and he said, well, everything is fine, but I'm out of hot rolls. And Mrs. James will hear you. And she will send Mildred over with some hot rolls about 5 o'clock. So at noon, Susan called, and Father went through the routine, and so helped me at 5 o'clock. There the rolls were.
Best rolls you ever tasted, huh?
Fine. They were excellent neighbors, and they always looked out for us, and when there was a need, you could always depend on them.
Did your farm have a name? Did you call it something
We
particular?
called it Asbury Heights.
And the James's farm was called? You don't remember?
Just James, that's all.
Mm-hmm.
Ours was never called, we called it that ourselves because it was bought from, that's where I knew Asbury Haynes was the man that the farm was bought from. And they thought it was, but it was never publicized that that was the name of it. Anyway, and then behind us, well, in the early days, there was a Mr. Davis who lived back there, who was a very, very fine person. Spent much time squirrel hunting over in one of the woods. It's the farm now that Nancy Smith owns. And the Smiths were there, I think probably they came out in the early, maybe the mid-30s. And Mr. Smith stopped in to see us one day and said that he was going to the hospital for a minor operation. And as could happen, he never came home. So it was too bad. He was a fine person, and Mrs. Smith was an excellent person. He had his daughter, Nancy Smith, who apparently is, I think, active in the Historical Society now. But she was very protective of the land and the ground and the animals and that sort of thing. And she wouldn't sell to Rouse when Rouse came out here. And all due respect to Mr. Rouse, I will say this, that he wasn't fair, in my opinion, to Nancy Smith. They had a right-of-way through a part of the property that we owned, the Smiths did, down to a wood lot that they had. And he threatened to make her take to court and put that right-of-way down into an area where it was almost impossible to get in there. But I think he realized along the way somewhere he was going to lose his case, so he dropped it. And I also think, I shouldn't really be saying this on the tape, but I'm going to say it anyway, that 175 that cut right beside Nancy Smith's house probably was promoted by Mr. Rouse and suggested to the state road that this is where they put it. So now she's got a farm that's cut into 1, 2, and Oakland Mills Road also cuts it into 3 different segments which you can get to. And I think anyway,
Nancy's going to be interviewed. She has granted us the interview, so I don't know when that's going to be done, but I'm sure she's going to tell us, because that was specifically what that interview was going to be about.
But they were very nice to me. I can remember on occasion the farm boy, of course, was pretty dirty sometimes, but I'd go there, and every afternoon at 4 o'clock they'd have tea and crumpets. Invite me in, here I'm sitting there at the very lush, all but we sat there and enjoyed ourselves, with Mrs. Smith and Nancy and myself, and I thoroughly enjoyed that, and they were very, very nice to me, and to this day I think they're wonderful people.
Did they have to run the farm by hiring help, or
They had a man there on the farm, and which they kept. And of course, they were the original organic farmers, really. When I'd be out putting chemical fertilizer on seed wheat, they'd be over there putting pulverized sheep manure on it. They also opened the areas up for a lot of the grain that they didn't harvest, so the birds could come in and feed. And I think if there's an overflow from the animal health, the animal health people of dogs, they take them in and take care of them. Very, very, as far as environmentalists are concerned, they were probably the first ones that were conscious of all of these things.
have they been educated, or that just something you think that came naturally?
Well, no, I think they were very well educated. Now, whether they, but of course they could afford to do that, you say. But they did it and practiced what they preached. But now the farm has deteriorated because it's inaccessible. It's hard to get to. And finally, they have a right of way down through. I know you know where Thunder Hill Road goes through. From their farm down to the woods, there's a right of way there that goes one of the streets. And it digs in her woods and digs in on the other end over in her field. And so at least it's there, and I'm assuming that every year they go out and drive a tractor down there or something. I don't know. On the other side were the Thompsons, and I mentioned Wes Thompson, who was, as far as innately having good manners, he had them.
How many people in his family?
He was very appreciative. There was, I think maybe there was another boy. Now, he was much older than I, and all of the children were much older than I. But he had a brother who was probably in the dairy business up around Clarksville, and 2 or 3 sisters that, but they all got a high school education or the equivalent, I think. But it wasn't easy in those days, because even when the bus took me from home to Oakland City through the 7th grade, and first year of high school, second year of high school, third year, I had to find a way to get to school and find a way to get home. And many a day or night I walked from Oakland City home. It was 5 miles or something. And but the last year they put a bus on there that took care of high school. So at least they saw me through my 4th year.
Well, because they didn't have enough money for the high school kids? There weren't enough kids attending high school?
I don't know. It just wasn't a thing to do. That was at the beginning of buses to carry kids to schools. It was a consolidation of schools where they used to have Oakland School, all those kids in one class, and they had all of these little schools all over the place, and then they decided to bus them and take them into, which is a prelude to what we have today. I think everybody gets a bus now. If you don't, you live too close to school there, they bus you across town to go to another school. Or vice versa, whatever it is. But
could you take us a little tour of what Ellicott City was like? Maybe some of the stores or some of the people. We've heard about some of them are quite some characters down there.
Yeah, well, Ellicott City, actually, the general appearance of it is not too different. The only difference today is that some of them have new paint on them, and the color is more Williamsburg than it was back in the old days. But the depot yard was there. Of course, the depot yard had the Clarke and Owens store, which has been recently sold, I think, and probably not sold either. I think the sale blew up or something, didn't it? They couldn't meet the
hardware store, you mean? I haven't heard anything about that.
It was there, and across the street was what they called the Candy Kitchen. And on the corner was a restaurant, the Valmus Brothers restaurant was on the corner. And right next to Mr. Easton's funeral home was right in that one block. But next to the funeral home across that alley was Mr. Kraft had a meat store there. And Crafts owned the property now that Slack Funeral Home has. And they used to raise animals up there, hogs and this sort of thing. And the story goes that Mr. Kraft sold his hand, the weight of his hand, so many times that it was worth its price in gold. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But he always told a story that there was this lady came in there one day, used to sell eggs too, and this woman wanted a dozen of capon eggs. And and he laughed and he said, well, there's no such thing. She says, it is, and that's what I want. So he said, I gave her a bunch of eggs and told her they were capon eggs, and everything was fine. But anyway, now all of the grocery stores, as you go up the street, all the grocery stores used to put all the fruit produce out on the street. And you'd have a little narrow alley that was just enough to walk through. And all the kids used to go through there and pick an apple off as they went through. And of course, this is all, how do you get into trouble? That's how you get into trouble, by watching people do this. So one day I figured, well, I'm going to pick myself off an apple when I go through. So I was going up. It used to be the A&P there, just below where Taylor's store is now, which incidentally used to be a jewelry store. And I picked an apple off and I went up on the corner and to hike my ride home. And this car came up, picked me up. It was my Uncle James, who was the judge. And he apparently had seen it. And Mr. Wish used to be the lone policeman for the whole of Howard County.
One policeman?
One policeman, and he had an office there in Ellicott City. And Uncle James told me, he says, David, he says, I was just talking to Mr. Wish. And he says that these boys are taking apples off the stand here. He says, I don't think I ever want to hear you doing anything like that. I said, no, sir.
Did the apple taste very good after that?
I didn't eat the apple. I never took another apple. But it was quite an experience. No, and all of the stores in Ellicott City where you used to go in, buy what you wanted, and some of them you would charge, and at the end of the month you get a bill. And but you knew everybody in Ellicott City. I knew at one time, I guess, most people in Ellicott City when I was in upper high school. But now I walk down there and I don't know a soul in the world, and I feel like a stranger. The streetcar used to run up and down through Ellicott City, and Ellicott City is very narrow, and people tried to park between the curb and the streetcar track. And every time a streetcar went up there, it couldn't get by a car, so the motorman or the conductor would get out and blow the car horn. And if the people didn't come to move the car, then they'd have to go in the stores and
Long trip up the hill. Where did that streetcar stop? What was it in?
up at there where the perhaps where's the firehouses up there now? Right,
Oh, that was the
Yeah.
turnabout.
yeah. I think the firehouse now is on the other side where the park's on. We're right beside it. It's right there. Yeah.
That's the streetcar that went the Edmondson Avenue extended route?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And went all the way downtown. Finally ended up on Charles and Lexington Street. There's 3 fares down, 3 fares back.
And what was do you remember the number or how much you had to pay to ride all the way down?
9 cents a fare. And it was, I think it was number 9 car, and it used to turn to 14, or 14 and turned to 9, I think. One or the other. But it took 3 fares, and you put one in when you got there, you got down to Rolling Road. There was another one, and then on Fillmore Street or somewhere down. You almost got downtown.
Was the streetcar used a lot by a lot of people out here?
Oh, everybody, yeah, sure. And, that was a real treat, you know. And you'd be coming out from Edson Avenue along there by O'Lello, and they'd start putting the speed on, and this thing would be rolling back and forth like this, and had these hand
The straps?
straps that you'd hold on to, and they'd start swinging like this. And I remember the kids just going, oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. But it was a good life. And, you know, you could see a lot on the streetcar.
What was the hotel being used for about that time? Was that a store then, or was it a hotel at that time?
As far as the Howard House is concerned, to the best of my ability, I think it always was treated more as for apartments or people who live there, and I can't ever remember it being a real hotel. And I do think that at one time there was a restaurant at one end of it run by a Mrs. Taylor, I've forgotten her first name now, who used to own the store. And they sold it to Jimmy Brown, who then later sold it to Paul's. And I think there's no store there now. But there used to be a restaurant there. As far as the Howard, only one unique factor of of the Howard building is that you can go in on the street and go up 3 floors and walk out on the whole street up there. Which is the problem with Ellicott City. You get down in there and you can't get out of it. And
Do you remember any of the floods that came and filled Ellicott City?
no, one of them I remember. Of course, that's a more recent flood that everybody knows about, but I've heard about the 1890 flood because that was a little bit before my time. But no, I'm not. I really can't tell you much about the flood.
Did your father or your mother have favorite stories about when they lived here as young people that you remember that they used to tell you?
Not really. I can't tell you, but we do have sayings in our family. Like there's one when somebody accuses somebody wrongly, or you're wrong about something. We just say Elsie Rosendale, and it means something in our family. So, Mother went to Hannamore, and there was a girl that she went to Hannamore with who was unjustly accused at one time of taking money, and it was proven that somebody else was doing this. And so the story was told in our family. Now when you do something, you're unjustly accused, and Elsie Rosendale, how unjust and cruel, that sort of thing. And, and that's, I can't really know.
You said your mother went to a particular school. I wasn't familiar with the
Hannamore
name.
Academy, out at Reisterstown, I guess. Yeah, sure it is. In fact,
And
it's
she
out
was
there
from
in-
here. How did she get all the way to Reisterstown to get, or did she live there?
Well, she went out there, boarded out there, and then they'd go out, well, 3 or 4 times a year and get her up, pick her up and bring her home. I can assume that. Now, let's see, 19. I assumed that first when they went out there, they had to go out with a horse, or maybe she took a streetcar. I don't remember.
Did she go through it 12 years, or was that still 11 years at that time?
I think it was 12 years. Of course, my sister went there too, but I know how she got out there. We took the car and drove her out there, and went out and picked her up on the, with an automobile. But I don't know. Of course, Mother could have probably took a streetcar from Baltimore and stayed with her older sister, who was much older and lived in Baltimore at that time. I think she married Dr. Martin, who taught at Hopkins, perhaps, and later taught at Princeton.
And the name was Dr.
Martin.
Morton.
And, I don't know. You
Gave you one thing about it.
when those things happen, you really just take them for granted,
Yeah. Did your dad go to school in the county, or did he also?
No, well, Father went to, actually where Ellicott City High School that I went to used to be Rock Hill College. Before it was like St. Joseph's College there. It was a high school. But Father went to Rock Hill College probably through the 7th grade. Then he went to Charlotte Hall boarding school down in Leonardtown. And then he went to St. John's College in Annapolis. And
Did most of the boys in his family go to school, or was it just your father?
my father was the only boy in the school. But now, Mother's brothers both went to St. John's. Uncle Edward, who ran a hardware store in Oakland City, and Uncle James, who was a judge. And I was kind of pinned in, really, because from the time I was knee-high to a grasshopper, my uncle was judge. Then when I got bigger, my first cousin was judge, so I was sworn to do right from the very beginning.
They had you.
And now I'm free, and now I'm too old to do it.
Cute.
Brothers that came over here, the two up on the, I guess it's on the river between Montgomery and Howard County. All right, they had made a deal with the Carrolls that they would supply wheat, a certain amount of wheat to the Ellicott people in Ellicott City for the Carrolls, but if they produced more wheat than the agreement, then they would be compensated for it. Of course, the Clarks are pretty thrifty people, and they made more wheat than they were supposed. then Carroll thought they could. So eventually that's how they acquired all this property, which I think at one time, and I have to tell a story about my grandfather. On father's side of the family was a millionaire twice, and he lost $1 million twice in the stock market. He dealt in futures in wheat and futures in gold, but that branch of the family owned Halen all through from Clarksville all the way down to the golf course, and slowly just disappeared. But the old man was on the ball half the time, and half the time he wasn't on the ball. So
Exactly where did they come from? Do you know?
the Clarks that came over here
The Clarks that came over.
came from Ireland. They were Scotch-Irish. They were sent by King James II to Northern Ireland when they decided to take over Ireland. You know, England, that's where all the problem is still there. And I think in 1790 or something, I think it got too hot for a lot of Protestants there. Apparently were Presbyterians. It got too hot for them, so three of these young boys said, let's get out of here and go to America. So they came over here, and that's...
Were they promised land here in Maryland, or they
Nothing,
just
just
came?
Just came. They said, it's too hot for us over here, we're going to go to America, and if we can't make it, we can't. If we can, good. So they... Good stuff. So they,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how much land did they own then? You said it was near the river between Montgomery and Howard?
No, that was Carroll ground up there that they rented. They used to work for the Carrolls. But they made a deal, if they produced more than a certain amount of wheat, that the Carrolls were obligated to give to Ellicott City, that they would be properly compensated for it. And of course, they weren't properly compensated for it. And once they got their feet on the ground here, then they acquired a lot of ground. And it was Walnut Grove, Halen, Limestone, where Barber is, over across into Trotter's Lane. They owned that. And then they came down to see the Carrolls owned a lot of property in there. Then they came on the other side and owned the golf course. They owned property up around Simpsonville. And I don't know, but if you get an old map of Howard County, you can see where the Clarks owned here. And it was, they were very diligent people. One of the Clarks have always, I always tell this story about the men. The Clarks are pretty smart men because they always marry good wives. And as long as they keep marrying good wives, they'll be reasonably good people, you see. But they can go out and raise all kind of help themselves, but the wives have to be good.
Do you know any of the surnames of the wives? Are they old Howard County families that we remember, like the Gaithers or the...
Well, let's see. Of course, this generation, everybody came into Howard County is new from outside, all the wives.
In your situation, though, Clark married Clark. You can't get that from
In
that.
my situation, the two Clarks, I think probably they were fourth cousins, my mother and father. And, let's see, Uncle Edward married Hodges, which was an old name up country. Uncle James married a Hopkins, which is a very famous name from Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And Aunt Crin married a Bailiff, who was unknown, but he was from Baltimore. Kirk was Montgomery County name. And then, of course, Roland Childs, who my Aunt Patty married, which was, I'm not exactly sure how famous he was, but I think probably he's been around several generations anyway, put it that way. But I must hand you, that's about Friday. getting back to Bloom's store, I can remember back in the early 30s, we caddied the golf course, you know, on Sunday afternoons we'd come over to the Ma and Pa Bloom store and get a Coke or maybe celebrate. And we'd sit on the porch, and that's before they banked the roads. And these old high cars would come down and make the turn, as 29 came down from Clarksville, make the turn, and there was a high bank on the other side, but the road, and these cars would roll over and hit that bank, and if the bank wasn't there, they would go on over, and then they'd come back, and we'd make bets whether they would come back on all fours or whether they'd turn over or not. But leaving, getting back to our house, the entrance, the original entrance to the house in Hilton Street, Hilton Hotel now, it comes up from Oakland Mills Road up there. But the entrance used to be from the house perpendicular to Columbia Road, and then it went toward Oakland City. Now, if you went the other way, the road was dirt, and it kept getting smaller and smaller, and finally you come to a place called Athelton. But beyond Athelton to Burtonsville, I think I went that road once in my life, because it got narrower and narrower, and finally, when you got down to the river, it was just nothing but two little paths and grass in between. That people just didn't use the road.
So you really couldn't go to Washington from
No.
here?
And the people that lived where we lived were oriented toward Baltimore, but when you got up to Clarksville, they were oriented toward Washington, you see, because it was so difficult for us to get to Washington. We had to go up to Bloom's store and then start from there and go to Clarksville and on up.
Well, how would they go from Clarksville to Washington?
On over to Olney and down through that way, you know. But when we come out our entrance, right opposite our entrance was Oakland Manor. The Oakland Manor was deserted. In 2020 or 21, there was a little depression, and a man named Lee owned the property, and he went to town and mortgaged it, got every penny he could mortgage it, put the money in his pocket and walked. The bank was stuck with that farm till whatsoever. In the Oakland Manor, the house, I think now there's a school there if I'm not mistaken, and we used to go back there, 2 or 3 of the kids, my brothers or sisters, and we'd look around and look for ghosts, and all this stuff. In the old barn there was an old stone barn there, which is a beautiful structure, and we had visions of whatever, the ghost all over the place back in there.
Didn't hear any good ghost stories, though. You were just looking for them.
We just looked for it. But I also remember that Mr. Whips that kept, had the blacksmith shop, which incidentally is still there, he used to keep game chickens. And he used to keep a couple game chickens over there in that old barn. And when they had the races at Laurel, these people would come up and buy chickens or borrow them from Mr. Whips, and they'd have a big time for it. While the races were going on. Yeah, fighting the chickens over there. But anyway, that farm, Oakland Manor, was deserted. The next farm up in 1931 became the golf course, Allview Golf Course. Previous to that, it was just a well-kept farm. The year that they built the golf course, it was drought year, and they ran trucks all over that, and there's no mark whatsoever to ever see because the ground's so hard. And of course, the stone house is still standing.
And who lived there? Do you remember?
No, yeah, that's the Dorsey one's only, but that house is where my father was born. And on the other side of the road was, of course, after we passed Charlie James's house, was what they called Thunder Hill. And a man named Lawrence Clarke lived there. Lawrence Clarke was, I guess, a second cousin of mine. He's some relation.
Without the squiggle.
Without the squiggle. And he had, but we don't want to go into Lawrence Clarke. Anyway, then of course, the 108, the road 108, that was called Annapolis, I think they called it a Annapolis Junction Road. I think that's what they called it in those days. But that was at the Bloom Store intersection. And on your left, going down, the next farm was Dorsey Hall. The house is still there. It was built by one of the Dorseys years ago, but Mr. Shapiro, who later owned Laurel Raceway and sold it to his son, his son-in-law, really, who used to be a baseball pitcher for the Orioles. I've forgotten his name now. But anyway, Mr. Shapiro owned that place. He sold it to Royden Blunt. And this was back in, I would say, 1933 maybe. Because when Royden Blunt came out here, they had all this hay that they had to put into the barn. It was August, and I can remember being about 14 or 15, going down there and leading the horse, the hay fork that pulled the hay up into the barn, leading the horse out, and that was my responsibility. But that was Dorsey Hall. The house is still there. Blunt sold it to on several occasions, but Mr. Shapiro built the house up on Folly Quarter Road. What do you call that house up there? You know, the big ones for sale now.
Very, very large house.
Yeah, anyway, it's up there. And then Mr. Blunt later built a house up at Glenelg. And he sold it to, since then there's been very little activity as far as farming is concerned, maybe beef cattle or they're made. I think of that sort. Of course now it's being developed. The house itself, it's a nice house. It's a beautiful house. I can remember going to, Mr. Blunt had a daughter that had nice parties there. We used to go down there and Halloween parties and all that sort of thing, you know. That's big time. But, and he was a very nice person too. He was in ran the Button Glass Works in Baltimore. Then you went down the road farther on the right-hand side. I don't know. Can't think of it. Next house down is Meadowbrook. Meadowbrook Farm's still there. Meadowbrook used to be owned by Mr. Mann, and they had dairy cows. And at the same, Mrs. Mann had a friend named Mrs. Jett who was on the other side of the road. And at the same time, they started selling sandwiches. Mrs. Mann's didn't go so well, but Mrs. Jett, I think, is still selling sandwiches there. So you got the roller rink and all that sort of thing. You know, where you go into the swimming pool. And
That's the little tiny white building there with the green doors in the front?
yeah, the big skating rink is out front in that little house there. The house on the far side of that, the stone house that you go through, that was owned by, all that property from the Jets all the way up to Red Hill. That woods there was owned by Uncle Edward. Uncle Edward used to live there. That's where his children were born. And he later bought Wheatfield. Now, Wheatfield is where great-grandfather raised his family.
So he went back then and
So
bought
he
his
went back,
his
he went back,
grandfather's
yes,
house.
that's right, and that was Edward. Now, who's in there now, I don't know. But all of those houses from Red Hill to the big stone house were built or on property that Uncle Edward owned. And he built some of those for the people that worked for him, because James Rogers was one. James Rogers was, and the next house belonged to a man named Hodges, who was his brother-in-law. They both sold feeds for Uncle Edward back in the, one sold Domino and one sold Pratt or Beacon or something. I'll tell you a story about James Rogers. Was quite a salesman. He was a nice person. He came up here from Tennessee through the Depression, had his Tennessee accent, and he was quite a salesman. And he had a nice personality. And he was just a nice person. And we used to get feed from him. We raised turkeys and chickens on the farm, among other things. And one time the turkeys were getting sick, and there was a new medication out called iodide vermicide. And James came up there with a catheter, yay long, and put this stuff down into the crop of the turkeys. And the turkey would go and fall and flop over, you know. And he left there, must have been 30 turkeys on the side of the hill, just flopped over. And James says, And the next morning, 5:30, James came back again. And the turkeys were up and everything was fine. And when I left here yesterday, he said, I was just so scared. I didn't know what to do. Couldn't sleep all night, he said. So he got up early in the morning, came up here. He said, I just didn't know what I was going to tell you, Mother, if all those turkeys
It sounds
were
like it
dead.
was a good name for that product.
Worked like a charm.
I bet.
But he was something. But he was so honest. He didn't even tell you anything. But he said, I was so scared. Anyway, all those, that property from our home all the way to Oakland City until you started down the hill down at Crafts, and was now, used to be farm country. And you knew most of the people along there. You'd see them. I've forgotten some of the names. But another little thing that's in this book, they mentioned Bill Wallach in there. Now, Bill Wallach lived in the old Oakland Mills School. I went there the first year, and the second year I went to Oakland City. Well, they fixed it up. Bill Wallach used to come over and borrow our horse. He had a nice garden. Borrow our horse to cultivate his garden with and plow and all this sort of thing. And he was just a good neighbor. But happy-go-lucky, always whistling, and big thing. And I can remember one time we went over there to help him dig potatoes. It was 3 boys, Johnny, myself, and Bill. Bill was 5. That was my brother. And Bill Wallach had a daughter, was 2. And I can remember Bill saying, why wouldn't you just be my wife and then want to get married? So he was 5 and she was 2, and she said, yes.
Did the romance bloom?
Didn't do it all. But I always remember that, Of course, they all proceeded to forget it, but. The Red Hill is where Jim Keenan lives. That's Red Hill. And the stream there is Red Hill Branch. But if you notice the dirt there, it's that red clay.
That's where the name Red Branch Road.
And that's where the Red Hill came from, and they call it Red Branch, and the Red Branch Road up to Plunder, because the stream down there used to have a sign up, Red Branch or something. But that's where all of that came from. It's legitimate, really. It's at Red Clay.
The one thing I want to ask you about is the church you attended,
St. John's Church.
St. John's.
Oakland City, when I went to St. John's Church, we used to go to church, maybe 11 or 12 people there. And it was,
Did you have a visiting minister, or was he one that was assigned to the
no,
church?
we always had a minister, I guess probably they took care of themselves, or there was always somebody around that, I guess, provided most of the necessary funds that were. But we always had it. There used to be a doctor, Bishop Helfenstein, who later became bishop, was there, and then a Dr. Dye. I don't know how you spell Dr. Dye, but I remember old Dr. Dye. He was a rather rotund type person, but nice person. And he lived in the parish house, which is across St. John's Lane from the cemetery. And then we went through a spell where we had 2 or 3 different ministers, maybe stayed a year or something like that. And one of them later became the bishop down in Tennessee, Van Ross, who incidentally came up home one day and the turkeys were up on the roof and he knocked the brick off the chimney. He got up there and put it back to the scene. But very, very nice guy. But then we had Mr. Parson, who came here before the war, just about doing the war. And he stayed, and that's when the influx of people came in. And then Al Rich came after Mr. Parsons retired, and Al Rich was there for, 25 years, maybe 30 years.
Between 25.
And did all this building, and then here recently we've had 1, 2, and now we're in the process. I think we have maybe a permanent person now, but anyway, it's one of those things. But as compare, you go down to church now, you can't get into church some of the services. And I would imagine that maybe 400 people packed in there. as compared to the 11 o'clock service we used to go to, it was 11 or 12 people. Had no trouble getting into church or any trouble getting out. But
Were the Clarks always members since they came to, or since it was established? I don't know the year of the establishment of the church.
as far as I know, the Clarks, our Clarks, and I'm not talking, there are Clarks and there are Clarks. I think some of the Clarks were Presbyterians, but our Clarks, as far as I know, have always been Episcopalians. Always gone to, probably to St. John's Church or one of the local Episcopal churches around. And I think probably grandfather, when he lived up in Fairfield, went to Old Brick Church, which is down at in Columbia. I'm not sure it's Episcopal Church anymore. It's one of these.
I think it's still
It still is. I think it went across there because it was easy to drive through. There used to be a orange brown road that was easy to get through. They used to go across the country like the crow flies.
Do you remember the first automobile that was seen in Howard County?
No, that was before my time.
Before time.
Yeah, I can go back quite. But I do know that the first car that I remember that we had was a Chevrolet. In fact, I have a picture of it. The Chevrolet beside that picture that I have of when I was about 4 or 5 feeding chickens, next to the house there. And it was an old touring car, and which we used quite extensively, I guess, instead of taking a streetcar to Baltimore sometimes. And one time Mother was, I think 5 of us, she had us in the car. There were 7 of us in our family incidentally. And she was going down Charles Street, and a couple of girls, I guess, got to fussing and fighting. So Mother stopped right in the middle of Charles Street and started spanking it. And the cop walked by and he says, lady, he says, don't take too long. He said, but do a good job and then go on when you get through.
Did you do most of your shopping in Baltimore?
All of the big shopping, yeah. See, there weren't such as things. You had to go downtown to go to Hustler's, as an example. Hustler's was downtown, that was it. And the stores that you had in Ellicott City were, they were nice stores, but they didn't provide a lot of the niceties that you needed. In other words, if you wanted boots or work pants and that sort of thing, you could get them in Ellicott City, but wanted a good suit, you went to Hustler's.
But you did most of your food shopping out of the shops in Ellicott City, though, because they were all fresh foods and stuff. And of course, you had your own farm, so you didn't need a lot.
Well, we went also, we did a lot of shopping down there. I can remember one time, I guess it was in the late 20s, when Jimmy Brown used to have a store there in Ellicott City. He later was over at Paul's. And, of course, we had a big family. Mother went in there and bought, this was the biggest order he had ever had up to that time, and I think it was $27. But you used to get, and 20, he said, that's the biggest order I have ever had. $27 and some pennies. But now if you go over and get a couple dozen eggs, it's all right.
Can you tell me about your first Christmas that you remember in the house? Something that was kind of... Did you have a Christmas garden that's typical of Baltimore?
No, only thing I can remember about Christmas, Sandy, is, we had a big family. We all had a stocking, around 7 stockings. And they were all filled up with pen knives and watches, and candy, and all kind of little knickknacks, you name it. Pulling all these boxes apart. When you get through in a room this size, 7 people have been pulling things that look like a tornado running through it, And then when we'd go to school, though, I can remember we had more presents than a lot of the children. You felt it. But they wouldn't yield to you. They would try to talk you into it. Now, that watch has an unbreakable crystal. Hit it on a rock and see if you can break it, or this sort of thing. They would try to make you break up your
Yeah.
They're really nice. And of course, watches in those days, I think, cost $1. And I don't know how much it cost. Now probably you can get them for less than $1 now. Those little digital things. But
So you didn't per se have a tree?
Oh, we had
the
a tree, but the tree, we always went out Christmas Eve and cut a tree somewhere. Either the native pine or the cedar. And it always went on the club table, hunt table.
Hunt table.
The hunt table that Janie has. Went on there, went from the hunt table yay high to the ceiling. Of course, there were higher ceilings than these. Then we trim it. No, we would put the tree up, but we wouldn't trim it. The children would go to bed, and of course we'd all gather upstairs, and there was a big mirror here, and we'd watch Mother and Father trimming the tree and not say anything.
You kept the secret well then.
But they trimmed the tree, and it stayed a week. But New Year's Eve, it came down, just like that. And I can never remember ever having any problem getting a tree or cutting a tree. Somewhere on our 200 acres, there was a tree there. And
So you weren't familiar with, let's say, the Christmas garden then, so...
no.
No.
We had a good Christmas home. That's. And I can remember when I was a kid. See, the Fairfield was across Oakland Manor from us. Oakland Manor, of course, was deserted. But I can remember taking a pie or cake. 3 or 4 of us would walk through there, and old grandmothers or grandfathers, and give them these things, and grandfather was a good person. I was 3 or 4 or something like that. He'd tell me to go like used to have buzzards in those days, go like a buzzard, make your wings, and all this. Must be silly question. But I can still remember that. It made quite an impression on me.